On this special episode of What's Going On with Shipping, how the Hunga Tonga explosion broke the internet. Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercagliano. So on Monday's What the Ship, we talked about the Tonga explosion, and we focused specifically on the issue of the tsunami. But one of the great things about this channel, What the Ship and What's Going On with Shipping, was some comments I got back in the YouTube comment section, which was regarding the communication with the island of Tonga. And I want to talk about that because it raises an issue that many people don't realize that is covered in the maritime domain.
Australia and New Zealand sent out surveillance flights to Tonga today in the wake of an enormous undersea volcano eruption on Saturday. Communication with the South Pacific island chain remains largely cut off, but there is word of significant damage. Nick Schifrin has our report.
A blast so massive it was seen from space. Satellite imagery caught the explosion and a ball of ash billowing above and beyond the Tongan Islands. Before the blast, thick plumes filled the sky, shooting up 12 miles above sea level. On Tonga, the tsunami arrived quickly. Communications are almost completely down and the death toll is unknown. But one confirmed dead, Briton Angela Glover, who ran a rescue dog charity. Her brother Nick spoke in the UK.
I haven't got the words in my vocabulary to even describe how we're feeling at the moment.
The explosion caused waves around the world. In Pacifica, California, harbors flooded. In Japan's Sakihama port, fishermen looked on as their boats sank. And in Peru, coastal areas flooded and 2 women drowned after waves swept them away. In total, around the world, the explosion affected at least 11 countries and territories.
It's a rare explosion that reaches the stratosphere, and that's what got everyone's attention.
Ed Vansky is a senior researcher with the Smithsonian's Global Volcanism Program. He says the eruption comes from a chamber of magma forcing itself through rock.
Just like in a bottle of soda, the gas that's contained in that liquid magma starts to expand. And so it reaches the surface, fragment the magma, and start an eruption. And when that hot magma hits the water expands and creates its own explosion.
A volcanic explosion that's believed to be the largest in 3 decades. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
So that was the latest update on the situation on Tonga from the PBS. And I want to focus on one aspect of that, and that was the lack of communications with the island of Tonga. And Tonga has been completely, literally cut off from the outside world. Australia and New Zealand has sent aircraft over to establish or reestablish communications. And I want to put that in the context. How is it that we can lose contact with an entire island due to this volcanic explosion? And it has to do with the floor of the ocean. Now, if most people know anything about the island of Tonga, it is probably this. So probably the most famous export from the island of Tonga is this guy right here, the Olympic flag bearer for the island of Tonga. Comes out every year. It doesn't matter if it's a summer or winter Olympics. This dude comes out greased up, ready to go, and he's a good looking guy. I'm going to admit that. I can admit that without a problem. I'm secure enough that I can sit there and say, okay, I can understand the appeal here for Tonga. However, there's obviously more to Tonga than just this dude. And the situation facing Tonga is critical. I don't mean to minimize it at all. The explosion took place just north of the island itself. And this Google map here kind of shows you where the explosion is. And if we zoom out here a bit, we'll start putting it into context. So just north of the island of Tonga to the northwest, west-northwest is Fiji. And then if we go out even further here, zoom out of here even further here onto our globe, you'll see where Tonga kind of fits in here. You can see, let me remove myself here so you can see it a little bit better. There we go. Where Tonga kind of fits in here. So there's Australia. There's the west coast of the United States right here. Hawaii up here, Panama over here, New Zealand down here. And this is the explosion right here that took place on the island. And we're going to come back to this map in a minute because this map is going to be an important part for us to understand why Tonga is kind of cut off right now. So these are the latest stories coming out Congo could take 2 weeks to restore. Could take 2 weeks to restore Tonga internet cable. This is from telecom.com, and that's the key thing. The way Tonga gets its communication is through a submarine cable. So you may think your cell phone, if you use your cell phone, if I got a buddy in Australia, I was just talking to someone this morning over in Singapore. If I call somebody on my phone to Singapore, I'm in beautiful Buies Creek, North Carolina, and I do this with my students all the time. I ask them, how is it that my phone reaches someone halfway around the world? And the answer you get right off the bat is satellites. Oh, it's all satellites. Salad. That's what does it. It's like, no, it's not. My cell phone links to a cell phone tower, which is fairly close to where I live. Now, it's just a couple of miles away. So the only part of this that is really cordless without wires is from the cell phone to the cell phone tower. Where my friend lives in Sydney, Australia, when his phone rings, he is cordless from his phone to the closest cell phone tower. How are the two cell phone towers linked? Cable. They're linked by a cable. Phone communication hasn't really changed that much since Alexander Graham Bell. You still need a hard wire cable to link most phones together. And to do that, from here in beautiful North Carolina to Sydney, Australia, or Singapore, or anywhere else in the world, or to Tonga, you need a cable. And that means that cable has to go underwater. And that means a submarine cable. So right now, news is populated with supply and relief efforts heading for the island of Tonga. This is a San Francisco story, a ship with relief supplies heading out to the island right now to provide relief. But other stories, like the one I mentioned to you earlier, talk about this cable repair ship to sail from PNG to restore communications to Tonga. This is a ship sailing out of Australia, heading that way right now. And that is the key. Most of the world's communications is done through what are referred to as submarine cables. And what do I mean by submarine cables? This is what I mean by submarine cables. This is submarinecablemap.com. There's a app for everything and a web page for everything. This is a map of all the world's underwater submarine cables. Look at these cables coming from the west coast of the United States all the way across to Asia. These underwater cables are pivotal to maintain the world's internet and data communications. You'll see a chain of them head across here to Hawaii, but then you have these ones that head down here into the Southern Pacific. And right here between Hawaii and Australia down here, this is the island of Tonga right here. There's Tonga. This green line between right here, Fiji. This is Fiji right here. We're going to zoom in here for a little bit for you. Here we go. So here's Tonga. Here's Fiji right here. Again, let's talk about where this explosion took place. Here's our map. Let's zoom in here a little bit. So here's our map. There's Fiji. There's Tonga right there. So just a little bit, again, just basically north by northwest of Tonga is where we see it. And if we look at this map, that put it right about here. And you'll see that this green cable right here, this is the cable that connects Tonga. This is the Tonga Cable. If you look at it, and here it is right here, this site has all this information you need for it. 827 kilometers long. Digital Tonga, its owners is the government of Tonga, the Tonga Communications Corporation. Got an URL to the www.tongacable.net. Go ahead and pull that up there, see what that brings us to. But that is the connection that links Tonga. And one of the things that you'll see here is then Tonga is then connected to other islands further down the chain in the communication area. And so the severing of that one cable there is fairly significant. There's another cable here too that runs from Hawaii to Australia. And I haven't heard anything about this cable, whether this cable has been damaged or not. It'll be interesting to hear. This detonation that took place under the surface would have rocked the entire bottom. And obviously it severed that cable. Now that cable is not a huge cable. It's not like older submarine cables that were the huge monstrous things that went under. These are fiber optic cables. that are laid by cable layers right along the bottom of the ocean and run that entire distance. And that cable has obviously been either damaged or potentially severed. So I went over to tongacable.net, and this is the site that unfortunately came up. The site cannot be reached, which demonstrates that that cable has been severed. So the servers on Tonga are unable to be reached at this time. This is another map. This one I was, again, directed toward by a subscriber on what's going on with shipping, and it was tweeted out to me. This is world-processor.com. This shows not just submarine cables, but the volume of cable traffic that goes. And you'll notice right here from Australia all the way down, from Hawaii all the way down to Australia, the massive amount of volume that goes on those submarine cables. If we zoom out here just a little bit, you'll be able to see that. You'll see those level of cables that trunk down here. It's not just the number of cables, but also the volume. And notice the key venues here. Some of these are just literally at the very end of the strings, so to speak. You'll see them all the way out there at the very end. Now, ironically, this is not new for Tonga. This has actually happened before. This is a GCAP in 2019 story where a ship anchor caused a blackout in Tonga. The ship had anchored on shipping charts, on maritime charts. There are specific areas where to anchor, where not to anchor. And the issue is that the anchor can pull up a submarine cable, which is not a very big cable, and sever it. And that's exactly what happened in 2019. The severing of that underwater cable cut Tonga off from the outside world. And what we're seeing right now is the explosion at Hunga probably severed that cable going to Tonga, and it's going to require a new cable to be laid. And so right now you have a cable layer heading up there, and they'll lay a new one in there. It'll be almost impossible to repair the currently damaged one. So you're going to see a new one come in there. So I may have piqued your interest in submarine cables and the fact that the entire world's ocean is crisscrossed with them. Again, the submarine map that I showed you is just amazing. When you look at this map and you look at where submarine cables are and how they're connected, I mean, across the Atlantic, all the way around the world, it's just amazing. Even along the Arctic right there, you see them being used. Just really just amazing. The one place not connected right now is Antarctica, but probably you'll see a cable there eventually. But if you're interested in this, let me direct you to a couple of great stories and sites on this. So first off, Marine Insight has this article, How Undersea Cables Are Laid by Cable Ships. So if you're interested in that technique, how are they laid? And they talk about kind of a variety of different techniques here: shoreline, shallow water, hard bottom area, and deep ocean. So that if you're really interested in that, you can kind of take a look at that. This one, this is from Mental Floss, 10 facts about internet's undersea cables, which I found really a great one. They go through a whole variety thing here. They talk about how cable installation is slow, tedious, expensive work. I have a student right now in a class who works on a cable layer, and he was laying one from the west coast of the United States to Asia. And they were passing Taiwan, and he had a realization that all of a sudden he was at the end of a 7,000 mile long piece of string that they were lying across the bottom of the ocean. So really incredible. Talked about how sharks trying to eat the internet so that animal life can impact it. They're vulnerable underwater as it is underground. So that's what we're seeing right now. Connecting the world throughout undersea cable isn't exactly new. That's true. And as a matter of fact, if you're really interested in this, if you want the history behind underwater cables, the History Channel did a series just recently entitled The Engineering That Built the World. And one of the episodes, which I watched, which I found really good, was episode 6, Cable Across the Sea, which talks about the laying of the first transatlantic cable prior to the American Civil War. Yep. Prior to the American Civil War was the laying of the first underwater cable. And there's also this link I'll have on here, which tells that story about the first transatlantic cable. Was a bold but short-lived success. It did not last long, that first cable, but eventually they overcame the odds and laid a successful cable. Back over here to mental floss. Spies love underwater cables. That is true. One of my favorite stories about underwater cables comes from this book right here, Blind Man's Bluff, The Untold Story of American Submarine Espionage. You ever want to read a great book? This is a great book. And one of the things that the US did during the Cold War was tap Soviet underwater cables. American submarines went into areas and laid cable tappings on these underwater cables to monitor Soviet naval and Soviet military intelligence. Now, they didn't get real-time data. They would record it, and then submarines would have to go back in, retrieve the recorder, and replace it with new ones. Just some really high-tech spy stuff back in the 80s and 90s. Great stories. If you really want something, I really recommend that story. Governments are turning to submarine cables to avoid said spies. Hey, why transmit stuff in the open air when you can do it between it? One of the greatest assets the United States had during World War II was the fact that there was an underwater cable that linked the United States all the way across to the Philippines. So from Hawaii, Midway, Guam to the Philippines, that had been laid at the end of the Spanish-American War. Very early on, the U.S. Army actually got involved in that, laid an underwater cable. And during the Battle of Midway, for example, the U.S. had direct communication with Midway, didn't have to transmit orders in the clear. The famous message that was sent to Midway to transmit that its water purification plant was out, the Japanese should have known that was a fake, because the Americans had a underwater cable that linked Midway directly to Hawaii and didn't have to transmit anything in the open at all. Submarine communication cables are faster and cheaper than satellites. Exactly true. It's exactly true. It's why we don't use satellite communications. It's too expensive. Forget cyber warfare. To really cripple the internet, you need scuba gear and a pair of wire cutters. All right. So one of my favorite things, I teach a maritime security class. Go back to this, map of the world here, these submarine cables. When I teach maritime security, one of my favorite things my students want to talk about is piracy. They love talking about, everyone loves talking about pirates. I talked about pirates not too long ago. Love talking about pirates. If you want to be a modern day pirate, I'll give you 2 ways to become a modern day pirate. I don't condone this. Don't go out and commit piracy if you do it, although you do deserve to give me some credit if you do this. One of the ones is go out and tap the underwater cables, just exactly as the US did. These cables are laid in international water. Nobody owns these cables out in the middle of the Pacific like this. Even though they're owned by the companies, they're laying them in international waters. People can do whatever they want in this area. This is the lawless sea. There's no UNCLOS. The UN Convention of the Lawless Sea has nothing out here. You can do whatever you want along here. So if you tap these underwater cables and monitor what's going across them, I don't see how you're committing a crime. If you want to get all piratical, if you want to get really piratical, pull up one of these underwater cables, put it on the stern of your boat with a pair of bolt cutters or a saw, and call the company that owns it and threaten to cut the cable unless you're paid money. That sounds like piracy, but that is a way to do it. Now, finding an underwater cable is almost impossible. Then hauling it up on a ship from several thousand feet of water is almost impossible. Plus, you do have liability laws on the vessel you're on. You're flagged in some country, so you've got to deal with those laws. So I'm not condoning this at all, but underwater cables, piracy is an interesting subject that they do bring up there. Underwater cables are not easy to repair, but after 150 years, you've learned a trick or two, and that is true. And again, I recommend you read this article. And then finally, the internet's undersea backbone is built to last for 25 years. Underwater cables are periodically replaced. The US Navy had an extensive underwater submarine repair facility when the US Navy created what was called the SOSUS array. This is a series of sound stations that monitor sound in the world's oceans in the Atlantic Pacific. They're all connected by cable. The US Navy operates a single cable layer, the USNS Zeus, scheduled to be replaced in the next few years. The Zeus would monitor and maintain, along with a fleet of other cable layers, but all of them are gone. The Zeus is the last one that remains. Maintain those connectivities to those underwater listening posts. And you need an array of underwater cable layers to do this, to replace cables and update them, increase their ability to transmit. And over years, they do decay and have to be replaced. So Tonga is cut off from the outside world due to the explosion severing an internet cable that was lying on the floor of the ocean that was just probably severed, rocked apart by the explosion. And this is something that is a potential danger. We see this happen quite a bit with vessels anchoring close to shore, where the submarine cables come in, and through just natural disasters as we're seeing right now. So I just want to let you know a little bit about what lies on the floor of the ocean. And that is 99% of the world's internet connections are running across the world's ocean's floor. And we tend to focus on ships above. We tend to focus on containers and tankers and bulkers and passenger ships, but underwater cables. That's the way you're able to communicate. And it's the way I'm able to text my friends and talk to them halfway around the world. If you found this video interesting, share it across those submarine cables. Go ahead, put it out on social media, link it over to a friend, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment so that we can fill submarine cables around the world with videos from what's going on with shipping. So until our next video, this is Sal signing off. And one last thing, again, hearts and prayers go out to everybody affected by the tsunami, and I will have at the show notes and right here at the very end the link to a Tonga relief site. If you're willing to contribute, don't worry about Patreon for me, just give to Tonga, and let's see what we can do to help those people suffering from this massive tsunami and explosion. So till the next episode, Sal signing off.